Hello, everybody, and welcome to our session on navigating cross-sector response and resilience through communications. You know, communications is a really, really important aspect, both before and after an event occurs. And so, you know, when you look about the importance of communication, it's a lifeline connecting affected communities, connecting emergency services, coordinating the response, and even after the event, coordinating access to resources. And so our panel today, we have experts in communications infrastructure to discuss the unique challenges and opportunities that arise in maintaining that necessary infrastructure. When you look at communication, it is both a critical sector and a lifeline sector. And so there are 4 lifeline functions identified in the National Response Framework, and communication is one of the 4. Transportation, water, and energy are the other 3, but it's so important that when it's disrupted, it really can cause impacts to access and impacts to the flow of information, and just really slows the ability for those to understand and respond. And so our panel is absolutely amazing today. We're going to have some examples as we talk about the role of communication, whether it's in responding to the Maui wildfires, responding to the Sanibel Island being impacted by Hurricane Ian. Absolutely vital. So I want to go down the row here and introduce our panel. Next to me is Nicole Hudnett, who's an industry advisor for the emergency response team at T-Mobile. Thank you, Nicole. Love the applause. Let's keep that up. Thank you. I have Joe Ruiz, who is, I apologize, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships for Red Lightning. Welcome, Joe. The applause threw me off there. All good. I have next to him Catherine White, who's the Head of Marketing for Google Public Sector.
Hello.
And last but absolutely not least, Peter Kim, Section Chief ESF2 for CISA. Welcome. Awesome. So, you know, when you look at the importance of communication, as I emphasized, it can't be understated. And there are simple communication aspects. I had an example with our team where my marketing team was at an event a couple weeks ago. We were in a hotel, 2:30 in the morning. The fire alarm, what I thought was a fire alarm, goes off. You hear the warble, you hear a sound that says, an emergency has occurred, please stand by. And then we heard the alarm for about 15 minutes. And so I laughed because I actually started a group chat with my team. I said, stay away from the windows. Let's wait to hear what's going on. And we're on like the 42nd floor of a hotel at that time. And so we weren't going to evacuate unless we were told to do so. And we're communicating, and probably 10 or 15 minutes in, another voice basically comes on and says, all clear. And you're like, okay, I'm half asleep. What is this? What's going on? And so I called down to the front desk, and you know, it was the dust got into the elevator shaft and set off the fire alarm, but everything's fine, don't worry about it. I also realized afterwards the next morning that I had, of our 4 team members, I was texting the wrong Emily, who was a college roommate and not somebody who was actually the person in the building with us. So my college friend from 20 years prior was getting messages about a potential active shooter in, you know, the city we're in. Communication, absolutely critical. So I want to go down the line and have each of our panelists introduce your organization and share how you work to ensure robust communication infrastructure before, during, and after an incident. And Nicole, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you, first of all, so much for having us here today and sharing this invaluable information with you. Nicole Hudnett, I'm with the emergency response team here at T-Mobile. You know, T-Mobile's committed to our public safety, our first responders, the lifelines that you discussed, the food, water, transportation, and our communities. And part of that commitment means having dedicated emergency response teams that are there coordinating those response efforts, working directly with these stakeholders to identify priorities for restoration in the community and get that connectivity there. We support them during blue sky and gray sky. You know, while we are an emergency response team, there's a lot of planning that happens during blue sky. We've heard some from our previous panels, a lot of that blue sky collaboration, because that is absolutely key to to affecting a resilient outcome for our communities. So from a blue sky perspective, we work very closely with our government and private stakeholders in collaborating, from FEMA regional emergency communication working groups to CISA working groups, our friends Peter at the end of the row here, to cross-sector working groups, working with power, with transportation. You know, without power, you don't have communications. Without communications, you don't have power. So it's absolutely essential that we develop those relationships and that we're working with them, collaborating, developing relationships on Blue Sky Days, so that when that event occurs, we're working in parallel with each other for that restoration effort. There's supply chain working groups too in various cities that work with all of those that are part of that supply chain, because that supply chain is essential into restoring your communities, and that supply chain requires communication, voice and data connectivity. From a dark sky perspective, there's the natural disasters. There's the hurricanes, the wildfires, the floods, the earthquakes, the winter storms that happen. Working directly with government to understand those priorities when you have major impacts to the network. And prioritizing with them where our resources should go first. There's also the man-made incidences that may not be a network impacting event, but they're a critical communications event. You know, over the past year, we've unfortunately had things like a gas line explosion that affected a hotel. We've had an active shooter situation a few times in the last year. When those events occur, there's things that we're doing that you probably don't even realize we're doing behind the scene. There's a lot of modernization in our network. There is a lot of densification in our network, meaning we have multiple towers in your urban areas. So when events like that happen, while they're not impacting the network, we're immediately identifying the macro towers that are serving those locations where those incidences are occurring. The modernization of our network that I talked about, from behind a laptop, we can optimize a cell tower. We can redirect antennas and down tilt antennas to have that concentration of network there for our first responders and for those that are part of those incidences and for the community that is in that area until they can get out of the way. We're identifying reunification sites, hospitals that are taking surges of the patients. And again, what network areas are serving those and optimizing that network for them. From an event perspective on Blue Sky Day, there's a lot of planning that goes into play for major events. These are large mass gathering events, and communication for the safety and security of these events is critical. So we're working with our friends at CISA and FEMA and state and local emergency management when these events happen. We just had the Great American Eclipse. How many of you, if it wasn't you personally, you know someone that traveled for that eclipse? Well, they were forecasting that eclipse to be one of the largest mass travel events in our country. That said, you were expecting a lot of remote areas or very small towns having an influx of people that they had never had before. Infrastructure was going to be heavily inundated, and communications, again, is critical for any type of response that might happen. So for events like that, we're working with our federal, state, and local stakeholders to understand where they're going to expect those surges and make sure that we're optimizing network, getting standby resources into play. Things like the Super Bowl, the Formula One event, we have World Cup coming up. There's going to be multiple cities with World Cup events, and that is absolutely imperative for us to have communications planning for those blue sky events. From a network perspective, our network operations centers are monitoring and managing that network 24/7. We have made significant hardening investments at key sites, at our points of presence, and at our network switches, including Puerto Rico, where T-Mobile is the nation's only carrier that is operating in Puerto Rico. We also have community support teams. While we're working directly with public safety and our critical lifelines, we have community support teams that go out there and help impacted citizens. They've lost their phone in the flood. They've needed to get on Wi-Fi to send an email. They need supplies. They need to charge their phone because power is out. So we have community support teams, and we have an amazing accessibility team as well that is out there working with the community. The Sulphur, Oklahoma tornado that just went through 2 weeks ago, it's a town of 5,000. When that tornado hit, it's also home to the Oklahoma School for the Deaf. Many people in that community, if they were not part of that school itself, they had very close personal ties to that community. Our accessibility team, which is part of our emergency response team as well, deployed to Sulphur, Oklahoma to help provide that accessible communication support for the deaf and hard of hearing. So, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. Joe?
Well, it's good to be back here. Been here before, but under a different moniker. For the last 2 decades, I led the UPS Foundation's health and humanitarian relief work. What you probably don't know is over that time, I worked with sort of a silent partner called Red Lightning. And Red Lightning is the organization that I've helped to basically over the years, when we needed to go into a very remote community to solve problems, we leveraged Red Lightning and their core of skilled volunteers, whether it's from supply chain perspective or communications. Back in Haiti in 2010, after the earthquake, with the Salvation Army, one of our partners was running a $200,000 people feeding camp. And as you can imagine, chaos, people trying to get their supplies. We brought, Red Lightning brought communications technology equipment that allowed us to organize the feedings. Everybody got an ID card, we scanned. They've been with us as the pandemic unfolded. One of the things that we were able to do in partnership with Red Lightning was send Red Lightning skilled volunteers into communities in Africa to help build the infrastructure and build capacity for those organizations. They would do training. Red Lightning would train ministries of health on ultra cold chain, how to receive donated vaccines, how to get those vaccines out of the main city into remote communities. That has continued to a number of countries, and in the aftermath of the emergency phase of the pandemic, Red Lightning has been very active in Lahaina in the aftermath of the wildfires there. Red Lightning, which was founded, the founder actually lives in Maui, so it's very personal, and is working to try to make sure that everybody, that critical infrastructure had internet connectivity, distributing Starlink satellite systems to strategic infrastructure at pharmacies, at the fire department, at the airport, and other critical distribution points around Hawaii. Currently involved in trying to establish a work camp for volunteer contractors who can come in at some point, and because of the lack of available housing on the island, to help with rebuilding and reconstruction. So again, Red Lightning, for those of you who don't know, is really, it brings the superpowers of private sector, people who want to give back and use their expertise and their skills to go to places. You won't see us in Oklahoma or Houston most likely, but you'll see us in places like Vanuatu, in Guam, in Hawaii, in Puerto Rico, where it's very difficult for all of the relief and response organizations to get to.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe.
Yep.
Catherine.
Hello, everyone, and let me also offer my appreciation for being included as part of this panel and this awesome event. Yeah. It's funny, I'm, as was introduced, I'm part of Google's public sector business now, but I previously worked as part of the T family and with MITRE, so I feel like I have a lens for this public-private partnerships that's kind of pervasive in terms of how do we really approach these issues systemically. And that's why I really like the way the introduction was phrased on, how do we approach things before, during, and after an event. And so from a Google perspective, and we were joking about this a bit at the break, is we're so used to the tools that Google provides that we take it for granted as it is actually a service or a product or a capability that we count on. But to be specific, we have, of course, very resilient and redundant capabilities around the infrastructure. So whether that's data centers that can withstand natural disasters, or whether that's redundancy in the servers, But we go beyond that in some of the secure collaboration platforms so that we're sharing the information, the tools, the communication, the data in advance of any type event. And then as we get into these emergency situations, these notions of public alerts that can be, through search, through maps, through person finder. I mean, all of these tools that were very common to us, but also think of using maps from the perspective of evacuation, shelters, road closures. I mean, the lifeline that allows for us. And then importantly, I think the translation capabilities. Even if we're fluent in English, for example, at that time of crisis, we may want to be in a more natural language for us to be able to respond more effectively. And then, of course, afterward, I was thinking of, the capabilities around Google Earth, where we look at the before and after to then prepare our responses, or to use some of the data analytics for how we would then apply the resources and triage in the most effective way. And again, each one of these, I think, is made even more powerful through the partnerships that we have at each stage of this to be able to better serve those who serve, as Nicole said, but also the constituents that are most affected. So that's the way I think about Google's capabilities in this space.
Yeah, super important. I think, you hit on the fact, Catherine, when you're in a crisis, you don't want to pick something up for the first time from a tool perspective.
Exactly.
And have to figure it out, especially when it comes to, effective communications. You spend more time trying to figure out how do I use this, but if it's a product I use every day, I'm very familiar with it, so now it's just the application of it in the crisis.
Exactly.
Which I think is really important. Peter.
Yeah, thank you very much for once again bringing me onto this panel. Looking forward to having this conversation in regards to emergency communications restoration. So, Pete Kim with CISA, and I am the lead for Emergency Support Functions 2. And under the National Response Framework, CISA is the lead coordinating agency for the communications response and restoration of the infrastructure. The two co-primary agencies for ESF2 are CISA and FEMA. Under that framework, we have a bunch of federal supporting agencies that support our efforts, and they are CISA, FEMA, the Federal Communications Commission. We also have the Department of Defense that supports us, and then we also have the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. So these are all support agencies that support ESF2 when we are activated. In addition to all of that, we have a public-private partnership called the COM-ISAC, the Communications Information Sharing and Analysis Center. This is a about 80 member organization with AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, Lumen, that are all a part of the COM-ISAC, where we're able to share information on a daily basis. Speaking of blue sky coordination, every Monday at 9 o'clock, we host the COM-ISAC meeting. And this is where approximately 100 of our partner agencies, industry members come together, and we discuss the communications infrastructure. If there is a hurricane that's kind of brewing out there in the Pacific or the Atlantic, we'll start talking and start beginning the coordination efforts for those response activities. In addition to the COM-ISAC meeting, we have a biweekly classified meeting where we share classified information with cleared industry members. That's so they can understand the different threats that are out there from a geopolitical perspective. On top of all of that, the third touch point that we have during Blue Sky Coordination is our training and exercise workshops. Of note, just last month, ESF2 hosted our spring training and exercise workshop in Denver, Colorado. We had approximately 150 individuals attend our training. Notably, Nicole was out there with us in Denver, Colorado to exercise a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake event. So it was a big exercise that spent an entire day where we went through the coordination procedures from the state level to the region level and then up to the national level. So those are the things that we do during the blue sky activities. During dark skies or gray skies, we also support the National Response Coordination Center that FEMA hosts, And then if need be, we will deploy down to the regional response coordination centers. And then in a really bad case, we'll deploy folks out to the state emergency operations centers to coordinate activities. One of the big things that we do during those meetings or during a disaster is what we call a cross-sector coordination call, where we bring together our communications industry providers, and then we'll bring in ESF-1, Department of Transportation, we'll bring in ESF-12, Department of Energy, and begin cross-sector coordination to ensure that, as our communications providers go out there to repair their networks, that the roads are open, that they don't have any access issues, that they don't have any debris issues on the roads themselves. With our ESF-12 partners on Department of Energy, we ensure that we're doing that cross-sector coordination where as power goes out and restores the power lines, that our communication companies are following them right behind so they could restore their assets as well. So there is a lot of levels of coordination that's happening, all due to the COM-ISAC and the National Response Framework structure.
Awesome. So much good feedback already, and we just did introductions. So I think just understanding what each of our panelists are involved in, the concept of what is done during, after, before an incident. I think, Peter, I might want to toss it back to you and kind of focus more on how you and CISA encourage organizations to prepare before an event to make sure that they have effective communication. So, I don't know if you have something to share on that, and we'll kind of come back down the line.
Definitely. Specifically for blue sky coordination, this is where all the work is being done. This is where that trust relationship is being built. And that's why we have so many different touch points within the ESF2 structure. I mentioned the Monday morning calls. I mean, every Monday at 9 o'clock, we're hosting a call with 100+ participants to go over what impacts we're seeing in the communications structure. And this is nationwide. We're diving down into the 10 different regions of FEMA and CISA to seeing what the actual impacts of a natural disaster, a hurricane, or a wildfire is. So that's one of those main mechanisms where we're, sharing information and building the trust with our industry partners within the COM-ISAC. So, and it's one of the main calls that we use with, our industry partners. T-Mobile is on that call, and we share that information back and forth of what their needs are and how the federal government can support their efforts in a response operation.
I think I might toss to Nicole, and we'll go back to Joe and Catherine here in the middle. Just keep referencing working with T-Mobile, which is amazing. So, what do you advise organizations to do today before, we're in a blue sky type of environment, right? So we're not under stress or under crisis. What should they be doing to ensure effective communications?
So that's a great question. Communication is a lifeline. It connects people to their loved ones following a disaster. It enables public safety and first responders to deliver critical services, and it helps businesses be able to reopen their doors, operate point of sale, and serve their communities. We heard a really interesting statistic in the previous panel just before us, and a very low percentage of small businesses are actually prepared for that. That said, it's absolutely imperative to have redundancy. Today, devices with eSIMs make it easy to have multiple providers in one device for agencies and businesses. Failover. What are you using today for failover? Are you using 5G? Do you have Go kits with routers and long-range antennas so that you can have data connectivity? You can pop up a bubble of Wi-Fi. People who may not even have the provider with signal, they can get on that Wi-Fi bubble and be able to make a call. PACE planning. Having a primary, an alternate, a contingent, and an emergency communication plan is absolutely imperative. When one method fails, you move to the next, all the way down, and Peter's going to talk more on this, I'm sure, about possibly even having to resort to runners. A PACE plan is imperative. I think back to a wildfire last year in the Pacific Northwest. 6 miles of fiber burned, impacting communications and data connectivity, internet services to this county. Lifelines were affected, the lifelines you mentioned earlier. food distribution, water, gas, groceries, hospital was impacted, public safety was impacted. Having that PACE plan, I cannot stress enough. And then you must exercise that plan. The time to learn about a plan is not under duress. It's before that event occurs. And exercise regularly. How many times do you put together a plan, put it up on a shelf, and forget about it until it becomes time? Exercising it routinely helps create that muscle memory. So when that event occurs, it's an automatic reaction to go to those different methods of communication. It is also a process for validating that plan that you have, and it instills confidence in the users to execute that plan.
Absolutely. You know, I think having everything set up, and then I think Tom earlier from FEMA talked about building flexibility into your ability to respond as well. So to your point, Nicole, you know, having backups to backups to backups. Joe, I think you've
Well, I'm gonna put my UPS hat on on this one. You know, from an internal perspective, you know, we have incident response teams that run scenarios every day. We have meteorologists who look at the weather and advise customers, and are constantly looking at all types of Plan A's and Plan B's. I would say that from helping small businesses get involved, I'm really proud to have worked with the Chamber, worked with Rob and Inez Pierce to build the Resilience in a Box for small businesses. So communications is a key part of that. How do you, in a disaster, and if something happens, how do you not only communicate to your customers, but how do you communicate to your employees, and what systems do you have in place? You know, how do you mitigate that? How do you plan for that? That's a key thing. UPS has also been involved in a lot of efforts with the UN supporting logistics capacity assessments, so we help them in at-risk countries around the world go in and actually look at all the capacities of that government, communication systems, fuel systems, and we document those things so when there's a disaster. And one thing I'm really proud of, I want to talk about, what Catherine and I have partnered with Google and UPS, actually worked together to develop something called the Emergency Flight System. It's a platform that allows humanitarian organizations to immediately see all of the Google flight information on flights that might be going in. So for example, when the Turkey earthquakes hit, immediately turning that on, 500 organizations within the first 3 days went in to look at that system and were able to quickly obtain cargo capacity on all the flights that were going into places near and in Turkey. And so that's been a communication system that has been really valuable for the humanitarian community.
Awesome. Catherine, you want to comment on the other side of that?
No, I just add that the ability to share best practices. I mean, this gap between thinking we're prepared and being prepared is both definitional and sharing of practices like the work at UPS that all organizations can benefit from.
I think
So if I can go on about PACE planning, I don't want to turn this into a PACE planning session, but I do think it's very important that every company, every individual, every family has a PACE plan. So once again, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency. That is your PACE plan. So a backup to your backup to the backup. And the example I like to use, 7 years ago, I was deployed to the U.S. Virgin Islands, and this is after Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit and completely devastated the islands. All of the communications infrastructure was destroyed. So I show up, and the U.S. Virgin Islands have to figure out how to communicate. So we're looking at our primary lines of communications, which is landlines. All of the landlines were down. So then now we have to go to our alternate communications. What is that? And it was cellular communications. Unfortunately, those hurricane winds destroyed all the cell towers. So now our A is out of commission. So now we look at C, contingency. What's everybody's contingency plan for communications? Typically, it's satellite phones. Now, satellite phones have its own inherent problems as well. If you've got poor weather, or if you don't have a contract in place, or if you don't even have a device or a subscription or a plan in place, those are unavailable as well. So the U.S. Virgin Islands was left to the E. And for the U.S. Virgin Islands, it was using high-frequency radio, ham radio operators to provide life-saving and life-sustaining communications. It was the ham radio operators as a nonprofit group that were supporting the U.S. Virgin Islands Emergency Management Agency to conduct life-saving operations between St. John's, St. Thomas, and St. Croix. And that's why it's really critical to have a PACE plan and understand what your backups are and what your backups are, because it can and it will happen. So definitely, if you are interested in additional PACE planning, you can go to the CISA website and just type in PACE planning, and there is a whole catalog of information there that you can turn to better understand how to better prepare yourself in regards to PACE communications planning.
I'm thinking through what I have right now. I think my friends and family think I'm crazy sometimes because actually my colleague this morning just said to me, how many devices do you have in your bag today? You know, 2 cell phones, 2 laptops, generally 2 power cables, 2 cell phones on different networks. My primary is T-Mobile, so, but you know, just thinking about like, where would I go? There we go. You know, it's where would I go afterwards? But I think in terms of it, when an event occurs and there's an impact, and this is probably more for Nicole and Catherine, kind of coming from the private sector perspective, how have you worked to interface kind of with government, and how do you build trust in that relationship when you really kind of need to kind of give and take from more public sector entities? And Catherine, I might go to you, and then we'll come back over to Nicole here.
You know, I was thinking about this. Imagine if our very best experience was with government, was at the time we needed it the most. It's not a technology problem. It's a prioritization and a leadership question. In other words, when we have a crisis or a moment that brings us together where what we're trying to do is be helpful or to solve the moment, I'm sure we all have learnings from the pandemic and other moments of crisis. What I find is that the mission, particularly at Google, where we really have this culture of helpfulness, where our mission is to try to organize the world's information to have it be more usable and accessible. But that married with the mission of all of what we do together, it breaks down the barriers to allow us to do, I think, really incredible work. So for me, that lens has been really transformational in terms of what's possible. Nicole?
You know, you said something about prioritization, and prioritization is really imperative in an emergency response. Government knowing that we're willing to listen and we're willing to work with them and prioritize where we can. You know, managing a disaster from behind the desk is not easy to do. You need to be in the room with stakeholders. When you have a mass tragedy, like unfortunately the Maui wildfires, which was one of the worst wildfires in U.S. history, we were there in the Emergency Operations Center in person, working with all of those stakeholders in person, identifying the areas in the community that needed to be restored first and foremost. Working with other ESFs, those emergency support functions, the transportation, power, healthcare, hearing the needs, and then being able to react quickly. Identifying the JTOC, the Joint Task Force Operations Center, where a lot of the public safety operations were happening in Lahaina and being coordinated from. That was a priority to get restored. Being in that EOC, I'm able to get that information, feed that back to our network teams. And we're able to get them additional devices and load things like ATAC so that they can track, they can create geofencing and know who's going in and out of an area. Hearing healthcare clinics that are being stood up. When you go to a healthcare clinic, it requires data, doesn't it, to check in patients, to send prescriptions to the pharmacy. All of that requires communication. So we hear those things and we're able to get those solutions there. The Kapalua Airport, ticketing and baggage and other operations were not able to be processed. We hear of that need. Transportation is one of those emergency support functions. So again, being in that EOC, you identify that need. We can send our teams there to provide those solutions. They're bringing the kids back to school. It's important to get normalcy restored to children's lives. Maui County Schools needs communication. They need access to data to be able to coordinate those efforts and how they're going to bring those kids back into school, where they're going to bring them back, or are they going to be virtual? So we're able to send teams to set up connectivity for them supporting the schools. So, building that trust means being there in the thick with them, listening to them, and working them to identify their priorities, and then having our team support that.
Perfect. And I know, Joe, you at Red Lightning are kind of working with both public and private sector, and I guess tell me a little bit more about how Red Lightning kind of what you do there and
Well,
how you kind of bridge the
again,
gap.
I kind of highlighted it's skill-based volunteers, problem solvers, united problem solvers. So that's it came from UPS, so we kind of picked that up. But again, playing on what Nicole said, during the pandemic, we literally went into countries where people were dying every day. We built trust with the governments. We showed and demonstrated Red Lightning on behalf of UPS went in to demonstrate how to manage, contain, transport ultra cold chain, the Pfizer, Moderna vaccines to remote communities. And you just don't get acceptance unless you build that trust with those organizations. We tend to move into areas that don't get the high propensity of response. We've supported Hurricane Otis down in Acapulco. The Mexican government, may or may not have done enough down there, but that was a low attention disaster, and one where a lot of organizations didn't have a national presence, so they weren't there. They may not have had a presence in Mexico. So we sent our people in to work with the Salvation Army and enable them to stand up services for that community, which was just devastated. We had UPSers that were eating canned tuna fish for over a month. There was no, there's what we're used to here in the U.S. with all the collaboration and coordination we've seen over the last 13 years of this conference, really providing that ability for us all to come together and close the gaps. We're not available down there. So, and I'll just say that, wherever we go, like on the border of Turkey, Syria, where, the largest concentration of refugees is in northern Syria from the Syrian migration of over a decade ago. And the Turkish government was primarily focused on Turkish citizens. So we're trying to get water systems across the border. Whatever it is, whether it's communication technology or systems or supply chain, that's what Red Lightning is trying to do, is really step in and solve that gap issue that is really caused by a broken supply chain. And really proud to kind of jump over the fence and support them.
It's awesome. No, I appreciate it. And I think, Peter, I just want to talk with what CISA does is a little, probably a little different from kind of the physical impacts we've been talking about. So think about, what should those that are joining us here and online today kind of think about from a cyber resilience perspective and what they can do. So if we take it a little differently, because that clearly can have an effect on communications.
Yeah, definitely. So if you are a communications company, I think that the most critical plan that you need to take a look at is the Communications Sector Risk Management Plan. Currently, it's undergoing a rewrite. There was the National Security Memorandum 22 that recently got published just a couple weeks ago on 30 April. That document has kind of reframed how the communications sector is going to be looking at risk management. But that is the first plan that if you are a communications company that you need to look at to understand strategic risk from a national level perspective, and then you'll be able to read that document and kind of drive down to how it really impacts your company of these different risks regarding natural disasters, extreme weather, supply chain risks, and cyber risks. These are all things that as a company, especially a small business, you need to be aware of so that you're able to manage that risk more properly.
Awesome. We're going to do a speed round here as we wrap up at the end. I love Charles Green, the trust equation, as we tie back communications with trust. Basically, Charles Green says if you have credibility, reliability, and intimacy or warmth, those are your positives. Your detractor, your denominator is self-orientation in building trust. Speed round, start with you, Nicole, go down the line. How does trust help or hurt communication, and why is it important?
Well, trust really requires a partnership. and public-private partnerships are essential in emergency response and building resilient communities. We work to earn that trust throughout the year with those cross-sector coordination, the regional working groups, the supply chain working groups, developing those relationships, creating those networks, knowing the resources that are available. And then when that event happens, it's time to deliver on that trust. We now are working with government to ask them, hey, we're here to deliver now. You know, what are those priorities? Let's work together to restore the community. You know, trust, though, is a two-way street. So we will also lean into government for assistance in mitigating our roadblocks to recovery. You know, Peter and I were talking in the green room about, you know, a refueling mission that we were trying to get to one of our towers. That tower was serving public safety. It needed to be refueled, but there was a roadblock, and the roadblock was not allowing our engineering teams to go through. So we trust that government is also in return going to help us mitigate those roadblocks. We're able to make those calls. They're able to get us the escort. They're able to get us the credentials and wherever we need in order to be able to get into those areas. They're able to help us escalate needs with cross-sector, whether it be with power or transportation. So like I said, trust is a two-way street. It definitely takes a lot of blue sky planning and working together to build that trust, but then you must deliver on that trust to keep that.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. Joe.
Just, I think more than anything, we see it in disasters. You need to listen to what local people, engage local people and the solutions to those disasters and that communications gap. We see it time and time again. We've seen it in Hawaii. There's a distrust from outsiders coming in. You see it in disaster response where shady actors come in, and so whenever possible, coordination with local, whether it's government, local entities, agencies, is really critical to building that trust. And always at UPS we say, you know, never promise more than you can deliver, and always deliver more than you promise. That's our mantra.
Love it. Catherine.
I think what the equation misses is time. It takes a long time to really build trust and can be lost in an instant. All of us working together, it's around defining those moments of truth that will define true resilience.
Love that. Thank you. And Peter.
So for trust, so I think that the key thing to remember here is the federal government has been doing this for a good while. The COM-ISAC was initially formed in 1984. So that trusted public-private partnership has been ongoing and maintained through the decades. So I encourage you, if you are a communications industry company, to join the COM-ISAC or join an association that is a member of the COM-ISAC. That way you could join us during blue sky activities to gain in the information sharing, the training and exercises that we provide, so that you are better prepared for those dark skies for when they do come.
Awesome. I want to please join me in thanking our panel. It's been a great discussion today.